Like many other people interested in wargaming, a couple of months ago I became curious when I heard that Decision Games had decided to republish a large number, I believe 18, old games by SPI in a new series called the Folio series. And there are many reasons why I was curious. The main one is that all of these games rely on the same core system, so once you learn it, then you can play a large number of games just by learning the specific rules that each game comes with. Also, these games are pretty affordable, usually less than $20, so I knew that I had to pick up at least one, which I did. And I tried Crusader Battle for Tobruk, clearly set in World War II, and the topic is Operation Crusader. So there is a two-player game in which the ally player is gonna lead a force sent against the siege of Tobruk in the attempt of relieving Tobruk of the siege, and the other player is going to be the Axis trying to prevent the ally player from accomplishing precisely that. Let's see how the game plays.
This is the map for the game, which is printed on paper. It looks simple, but given the landscape involved in the action, you really can't expect much more than this. More importantly, it is very functional, it works very well. During the initial setup, the majority of the allied units will be located in this area because they are the relieving force that is sent to relieve the siege of Tobruk, and then of course you will have some allied units in the Tobruk area, and all these like strange X sites that you see represent the minefields and other fortifications, which are going to be extremely hard for the Axis player to go through. And the Axis player will have his units located around Tobruk and in this area here. The Axis player wins the game if at any point during the game he has a unit in Tobruk, and the ally player wins the game if at any point he can demonstrate that there is an uninterrupted continuous line of access which is free of enemy units and enemies also control, and that goes from Tobruk to one of these hexes here that represent the allied lines of supply. Any other result is a draw.
Units have three relevant pieces of information: attack, defense, and speed. Some units also have an M there that indicates that they have several advantages, which I'll explain in a second. The turn track will tell you who is the first player in each turn. In this game, the ally player is always the first player, but I'd imagine that in other games of the series things may work differently. The first thing that the active player can do is to move any and all of his units up to the speed value of each unit. Of course, each unit will have to pay a price for each X in which it moves, and the price depends on the type of terrain. In this game, the two most common types of terrain are by far desert X's, which cost 2 movement points per X, and trail X's, which cost 1 movement point per X. All the units in the game project a zone of control into the 6 axes surrounding them. An enemy leg unit, which are the ones without the M here, an enemy leg unit that enters a zone of control will have to stop and end movement for that turn. Then next turn it can move away from the zones of control, or it can move into another zone of control X, but in that case again has to stop immediately. An M unit, a mobile unit that enters an enemy zone of control, will have to spend half of its movement points in addition to whatever is spent to enter that X. In this case, for example, to enter Desert X costs 2, and half of this is 7, so it would be a total of 9. This unit still has 5 movement points that could be spent to move away from there. However, if a mobile unit starts a turn in an enemy zone of control, it can move away or it can move into another zone of control X, but again by spending half of its movement points in addition to whatever it costs to enter that X, and then it can keep moving normally. Once the active player has completed movement, he can launch attacks against enemy units that are at that point adjacent to his units. Attacking is always voluntary, it is always against an individual unit, and the attacker can decide to assign several units to a certain combat. For example, in this case, the Axis player has 3 units here that are adjacent to 2 allied units, and if it is the Axis player's turn, you could decide to use all 3 units in a single attack against that unit, or you could send these 2 units in an attack against that unit, and then having this other unit performing a individual attack against that unit. Then, after all combat has been resolved, the active player has the option of moving any and all of his mobile units that have not moved yet that turn, and also after that optional movement, to attack with any and all of those units that have not attacked yet in that turn. So a standard turn basically is active player executes regular movement, then regular combat, then optional mobile movement, and optional mobile combat. And then it goes to the player that goes through the same sequence. Once a combat has been declared, the first thing that you do is you find the base combat differential for that combat. The way you do it is by adding together all of the attack factors of the attacker and subtracting the defense value of the defender. In this case, for example, if we have these 3 Axis units attacking that allied unit, then the total of the attack is 6. You subtract 5, which is the defense of the defender, then you have +1, and that is the base combat differential for that combat. The turn track will tell you which support markers are available to each player during each turn, and that number can change in different phases of the game. Also, that number will determine the type of support markers that you can use, because if you do not have all of your support markers available during a certain turn, then you have to leave out the best ones. Yeah, otherwise it would be too easy, wouldn't it? Starting with the attacker, each player has the option to commit up to 2 support markers in each combat. So basically, if this is the attacker can commit 1, then the defender can commit 1, then the attacker another 1, and then the defender another 1. So the defender has the advantage of committing the last marker after he has seen all the markers that have been committed by the attacker. As you can see, markers have different values, +6, +8, +4, +2, +10. So basically, after all markers have been committed to a certain combat, you just add those modifiers to the side that has committed them. That will also modify the final combat differential, and once you have that number, then you can move on to the next step. Once you have the modified combat differential, then you look at the combat table to resolve that combat. This table takes into account the terrain where the defender is located, and I like the fact that here the terrain of the defender is not abstracted in another modifier, plus something, minus something, but in basically an indication of the column that you will use to resolve that combat. For example, if I am attacking with a combat differential +5, a unit which is defending in rough terrain, then I will use this column here to resolve combat. If I had the same combat differential +5, but I am attacking an enemy which defends in a desert X, then I use this other column here, which is much more advantageous for the attacker. So I find it a very elegant, very nice, and also detailed and accurate way of taking terrain into account. Once you roll the die and you cross-reference the result with the appropriate column, then you find the result for that combat. And the results on the combat table may be that the attacker is eliminated, or the attacker loses a step here with the A in parentheses, or the attacker may have to retreat the number of X's indicated by the number. There may be an exchange, in which case both the attacker and the defender will lose a step, or the defender may have to retreat by that number there. In very rare cases, the defender will be eliminated. So as you can see, actually, the table seems to be favorable to the defender, because in most cases the attacker will take quite some damage, in other cases both players will take some damage, and in other cases the defender will retreat. There are not results that inflict a step loss on the defender and not one on the attacker. So actually the best way for the attacker to eliminate enemy units is to force them to retreat into zones of control that you are projecting, because if that happens, then actually the defending player cannot legally retreat and that the retreating unit is eliminated. So unless you're willing to take a lot of damages, a lot of attrition, so to lose some steps every time that you are inflicting some step losses, then you really have to work on maneuvering and positioning your units in such a way that you can prevent the enemy from retreating. Supplies are handled in a pretty abstract way in this game, but it is an abstraction that works. I think it really feels right. Here, units are always in supply. You do not have to demonstrate an uninterrupted line of free access to a supply source symbol. However, each side still has some of these supply symbols, and it is very important that each side defends those axes, because if there is an enemy unit in one of the axes with your supply symbol, then you immediately lose half of your support markers. If there is a unit in two of these axes, any two, then you lose all of your support markers. And trust me, a side that does not have support markers that fight against a side that has all of its support markers, it's really gonna have a hard time. The game has only one scenario, but I still find that it has good replayability because the game has to make quite a good and strong historical flavor. So trying different strategies, starting always from the same situation, does give me the sense that I'm studying a what if. So it still is interesting. And also the events in the game can go in quite different directions, and they will be mainly determined by the early decisions that the Axis player takes. Because the ally player at the beginning does not really have many decisions, the people that are in Tobruk probably wants to stay there. There is no reason for them to lose the advantage of the position that they have, and the relief force probably is going to go not towards China or Japan or Australia, it's going to go toward Tobruk. That's the very point why the relief force was sent in the first place. The Axis player caught in the middle will have to choose whether he wants to concentrate units against Tobruk and try to give the final push against the people in the city and take the city before the relief force arrives to spoil the party, or if he wants to concentrate units against the relief force, so just leaving as light a sieging force as possible around Tobruk and trying to smash the allied reinforcements as they are arriving. And the Axis player really has some excellent panzer units that are perfect for that, or maybe he can choose to do something in between, splitting forces, trying to achieve these two objectives, taking Tobruk and stopping or slowing down the relief force. Overall, I really like this game. I think it has interesting and tough decisions for both players. For the Axis player, there are going to be hard moments, especially if he decides to attack Tobruk in full strength, just because going through the fortifications and the minefields around Tobruk is devastating. And for the ally player, there are going to be challenges, especially if the Axis player decides to attack the relieving force in the middle of the desert with full strength. Either way, there really are going to be interesting things that are going to happen. The flow and the pace of the game, I think, works very well because there are different things that have been abstracted and incorporated pretty well, pretty elegantly, I would say, in the general system of the game. For example, I like the way in which supplies are really abstract and yet you do feel that are really important, or the same thing could be said for terrain that has been incorporated in the battle. You don't have that extra modifier that you have to calculate. I really like the support system, how you assign support and you have that little bit of outsmarting, outguessing there, that adds flavor and makes things a little more unpredictable, yet not completely random, because the way you manage your markers, after all, is completely up to you. So really good game. I'm glad I played it. I really had a good time doing so, and I do believe that I'll be playing more games in this series in the future.